There we go. I'm back.
Yeah.
This time slightly more prepared. Let's see how we set this so it's not so.
Okay, for some reason Soli can't access. Okay, sorry, I just have to get Soli in here. 1 second.
All right, no problem. I'll figure out some other things.
One thing in the meantime, I can just make you a co-host.
All right, very good.
And start sharing and whatnot. Is there anything else you need me to help you with right now?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Hopefully I won't need too much help.
Could you do me a favor, maybe, Laurie? Could you send me the registration link on Teams?
Okay, sure.
Not the registration link, the actual access link.
Okay, sure. One problem, like I'm not 100%. Oh, did I not? Okay, let's see. It might be easier if I email it, because when I tried to copy the link across to let's see how this goes. I'll send it on Teams and we'll see if it's workable. Let's see if the link works. Because when I tried to but if someone's accessing from a work computer, I guess it's okay.
Soli's calling me. 1 second. Hi, Soli.
Hi, James.
Yeah.
Did you see what I wrote here?
Yeah, yes, and I just replied. I'm just getting you the link now.
Sending it by email?
I might be, or I might just WhatsApp it to you. Let me just see.
Well, email is better because it will appear on my computer and
Okay, no problem then.
Okay.
Sorry. Bye. Soli.
So this is recording. Examples of what not to do. Yes.
Things that go wrong, and you go back and review.
Why never to ask Laurie Noguchi to talk again?
Of course not. No.
We'll see. You haven't heard the talk yet. It's quite possible. When I always worry when things are recorded, because sometimes you're speaking and you say things, and later you think, no, that's not the right way to say. That's not what I meant.
Same. I completely understand from my own experience lecturing. Yeah, it happens all the time.
So where were you lecturing? Do your work. If this is interrupting you, don't.
Yeah, I'll be very happy to tell you once I've got Soli in. He still doesn't seem to have. Okay, he says that I need to let him in, but he's not showing up.
4 people in the waiting room. Okay, maybe now I have to do that.
No, you don't have to. I'm deliberately not letting people in just.
Oh, I just let them all in. I'm so sorry. Too late.
All right, no problem. We'll live.
Okay, so nice to meet you, Dr. Noguchi.
Hi, nice to meet you as well.
Ah, great. How is everyone? Is this only us?
No, we have a few more coming.
Ah, okay. So before we start, shall I say 40 minutes would be okay? 40, 45 minutes for your lecture?
I will try and keep it within that time. That's
But
that
if
is the plan.
no problem. Just make asking in order to know.
Yeah, I'm aiming for 45 minutes. My practice sessions have sometimes gone longer, but I also know that when I've practiced and in the moment, it tends to go much faster.
Great.
Let's see.
Have you been here for long?
In Israel?
Yes.
About a year and not quite a half. Yeah.
That's quite enough. And how is it compared to Hong Kong? I mean,
I'm really enjoying. It's of course, Hong Kong is very, very urban, big city, but and so I'm enjoying a more relaxed situation in Haifa. But the pandemic has made everything quite.
Well, it might be relaxed only within the compounds of the Bahá'í World Center. It's not,
That's possible.
it's not a relaxed area.
Hello, Laurie.
Hello.
I'm thankful to my colleagues from the University of Haifa because I'm the University of Jerusalem, Hebrew University.
Nice to meet you.
Pleased to meet you.
And what is the subject that you teach?
Well, I happen to be the vice president of the university.
You have the more complex job of managing the entire.
And since you are based in China, in Hong Kong, you'll be pleased to know that my better half is the ambassador to China.
Oh, really? Wow, how interesting.
Yes, indeed.
And how does she like it there?
Well, she just started. I mean, less than 5 weeks there, of which 3 weeks in seclusion because of Corona. So she's just starting.
Well, I hope she enjoys. Is she based in Beijing then?
Yes, of course.
Beijing's a nice, it really is an interesting place, and hopefully she'll have a good experience.
And how are things in Hong Kong nowadays?
In talking to friends there, of course, the political situation is quite volatile in a sense. In terms of COVID, it's not bad. They take things very seriously. The schools are back, the university is back in session, they're having classes. They're told to open the windows. I was seeing today that the building that I worked in, the Centennial Tower, which is where our department was located, none of the windows actually open there. It's, a modern building, so it doesn't open. But really, it's fine. I think, life is reasonably normal.
Well, I just finished reading the history book of the two Jewish families of Hong Kong, the Kaduris and the Sassoons. It's a fascinating book.
And the Kaduris have done a lot for Hong Kong. There's a center at the university, and they've donated, in many, many different settings. They're definitely a well-known family foundation.
Well, certainly in Israel, they are well known.
They started the electrical plant there, right? I think.
They started the
electrical plant.
Well, and the Kaduri School and many other things
Yes,
that they have here in this country, including our university.
Two Jewish Iraqi families.
Yes.
You have a presentation to make? Slides?
Yes.
So, James, are we okay with the
Yes, we are.
co-hosting and stuff? Okay.
Yeah, all ready to go.
I see Hebrew University is very active here, and we are joined by Professor Barasher. welcome.
Hello, hello, shalom, shalom.
Shalom וברכה.
Hello?
Shalom Yossi, shalom kulam.
Shalom, Meir. Meir and I, Professor Barasher and I grew up in the same neighborhood in Jerusalem, and we've known each other for 2 generations, I think.
How wonderful. How wonderful to have that connection. You know, I moved a lot growing up. We moved all over the United States. And, you know, then after university, I ended up going to China. And I did my master's in China, came back to the US to do a PhD, and then went back, you know, and was basically in either Macau or Hong Kong and working in China for, you know, my working life. And so all of my friends are scattered, you know, and except the one that just logged in, Mary Bach, who is a friend that I have known since grade school, and who probably is here largely to figure out what it is that I do, since it's probably never been very clear. But it's wonderful to have that sort of connection over so many years, both for me and Mary and for the two of you, I'm sure.
Well, it's almost 30. So that's what we have, James.
It's the quality that counts.
Yes, of course.
I know we're expecting at least one more because my mom was going to come, but we'll see how that goes. Again, as I say, many people don't really know what I did. So family members as well as friends. I thought I would invite 2, so at least they could get a sense of the kinds of things that I've been involved in, especially since coming to Israel and with the development organization.
So shall we wait for your mom to join?
No, I think we're fine. Let's see, as long as it's 4:30, she'll log in or not. So yes, I'm happy to get going if you're ready.
Yes, we are. I think. Do we expect more, James?
Yes, we do, but you know, people.
You want me to wait another 5 minutes?
It might be a good idea. Just
Okay.
maybe.
So let's wait another 5 minutes. Sure, no problem.
How Afnan is waiting for second vaccination. They had a little delay, so I don't know whether she makes it in time or not.
I see a number of people look like they're logging in right now.
There we go.
I know it's been wonderful to be in Israel with all of, you know, with the vaccines rolling out the way they are. It's really fantastic.
Oh,
Here she is.
okay. Mayor, how is Professor Sharon? Is he okay?
He's not perfect, but improving.
Oh yes, okay.
He's improving a little bit. He was not so good in the last few weeks. You remind me that I plan to talk to him regarding Bahá'í affairs. So I will know more tomorrow or after tomorrow.
Please do send my best regards to him.
I'll do.
Okay, if it's okay, we can start now. I'm always privileged to have this gathering, which since the former 2 lectures ago, we started it through the Zoom because of the circumstances. And it is those circumstances that connect us to this lecture of today, which is a very, apart from its academic and social aspects that there is into it, it has also a very a question that the globe, we can say, is dealing with, so trying to actually meet the challenge. And for that, I think we have one of the best lecturers that we can think of, and especially that what I expect is to show us a new view of the situation that we usually don't hear or don't confront on this or other way in the media or elsewhere, or the academics even. So today's lecture is by Dr. Lori Noguchi. I hope that I spelled it right.
Yes.
And a short bio about her. She's the director at the Baha'i International Development Organization. Prior to her work at the development organization, Dr. Noguchi was the deputy director of the Master of Nonprofit Management program at the University of Hong Kong, teaching courses related to nonprofit management, social policy and development, and she was also president of the Bahá'í Foundation in Macau. She worked with the community groups and nonprofit organization in Asia, both as the president of the Bahá'í Foundation and as a consultant to international, regional, and national agencies and organizations, helping to facilitate community development, gender equality, and substantial development. Through her service on several nonprofit and regional boards, she has also worked closely with the organization through Asia, including Philippines, Japan, Mongolia, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Thailand. And today's lecture, it would be on fostering community resilience and empowerment in the pandemic. Insights and questions. So the floor, the microphone, and the camera is yours, please.
All right, well, thank you very much. And it's a great chance to be here. And I'm looking forward to, hopefully, you know, that was quite a big expectation to offer something new insights. And I hope that I can. I think, let's get that, there we go. You know, it's, there we go. So this question of resilience and empowerment in the pandemic, you know, if we look at, where are we? Oops, sorry, it looks like I have gone. Not
James, are we recording this, James?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
So the question of fostering community resilience and empowerment has been one that's been on my mind since really quite early. And as you heard some of the background I come from, community empowerment, community development is an area that I've been very interested in. And if we look at, you know, 1 million years ago, in March of last year, it seems so long, when the pandemic was just beginning really. To demonstrate its impact. The Universal House of Justice wrote that, you know, seldom has it been more evident that society's collective strength is dependent on the unity it can manifest in action, from the international stage to the grassroots. And as I looked at what was happening, you know, early on from, you know, at the very beginning, you saw so many demonstrations of collective goodwill, you know, and just the selection, a random selection of pictures here, Italians singing from their balconies during lockdown and bringing cheer and, you know, demonstrating community solidarity. The picture in the upper right is Israel, but throughout the world, you know, people coming out to thank frontline workers for the risks they were taking. And the lower left picture is from Singapore, where a community recognized that hand sanitizer was hard to come by and organized to produce it themselves and distribute it to all their neighbors. And the two pictures on the right, everywhere in the world, people were making masks to make sure that their neighbors had access to the kinds of products, you know, masks, sanitizer, everything that might be needed to keep them safe. And so on the one hand, we saw at an individual level and sort of at a local level, how communities responded and this desire that people have to contribute to the betterment of those around them. We also saw at an international and national level, the impact that collaboration and unified action could have. So, you know, the rapid development of an innovative approach to vaccination, the way that evidence-based measures to control the virus were shared throughout the world and better practices could be adopted among those who were willing to adopt them at all. We also saw collaboration amongst healthcare organizations and this was an example particularly from the United States, where a group of my former classmates from college are now working in hospitals in Boston, very competitive private hospitals that normally compete with one another. But as soon as the pandemic, it became clear was going to impact the community in the United States, they began to see how they could collaborate to manage patient flow, to assure that every hospital had access to protective gear. And, in country after country, we've seen that where attention was given to equitable and just distribution of resources, whether it was PPE or it was, other resources, health resources as things advanced, the impact of the pandemic was lessened. And we also saw the importance of a united response of a population to government guidelines. And we saw what happens when that doesn't happen, when there's not unity of action, when there's no clear plan. You have situations like in the United States where it's only 5% of the world population, but 40% of COVID deaths, and we saw in many communities where you couldn't muster a united response, where response to the pandemic became political, the impact of the pandemic was worsened. Whoops, it's not listening. Let's see, there we go. So in some sense, the pandemic is also demonstrating the limits to humanity's collective strength in the current political sort of and social system. And we see that, of course, the pandemic hasn't created the kinds of inequalities and injustices that exist in the world, but because they do, the pandemic exacerbates the impact. So in country after country, historically disadvantaged communities, poverty, minorities with limited access to resources, those communities have had the worst health outcomes. Economically, the International Labor Organization estimates that 114 million jobs have been lost during the pandemic, but an equal number of work hours have been lost through the reduction in hours. So workers haven't lost their jobs, but they've lost hours and therefore income. And one can easily see, and I think it's in the news all the time, the economic impact, the hardship that families are going through because of this. But at the same time that this is happening, the 10 most wealthy individuals in the world increased their wealth by $540 million. The 660 most wealthy individuals in the United States increased their wealth by 40%, almost $1 trillion. And so where there was already injustice and there was already inequality, that has worsened during the pandemic. And, we've also seen how top-down responses that might very well be necessary often created unanticipated problems, or even when those problems were anticipated, the government had no means to cope. Just to give two short examples, we have India, where the sudden imposition of lockdown caused a reverse migration, where so many people who had come from rural areas to the major cities that were working either in the informal sector or in factories and other jobs that were shut down during lockdown, had no means to support themselves, because many of these people are day laborers. You earn income one day, you use that to live the next. And so what did they do? They decided to go home to the rural areas, which are usually better able to cope, at least to have food. And so all of a sudden, we ended up with masses of people having to walk because transportation had been shut down. And, then India, of course, the government tried to respond to this. It ended up arranging buses and other transportation, which, but accidentally they'd created the conditions for the virus to spread to rural areas. And then that had its own impact. Just to give another example of possibly necessary responses, but ones that were very hard for governments to cope with. any of you who have talked to people with children, and I know a few people here have their own children, adjusting to, when school shut down and it becomes online, how difficult that's been. When I was living in Macau, the foundation that I worked for, Bahá'í Foundation, had a school, but it's in Macau. It's well resourced. It has good access to internet. And despite that, it's been a real struggle to assure that children get good quality continuing education. Although Macau opened up quickly and teachers really worked hard to advance. That said, 2/3 of the world's children don't have internet access. So what happens to their education? And how have, and governments just haven't been able to cope in most cases. And I think the other sort of limit that we saw was how lack of trust in authorities and in science in general led to a reluctance to follow health guidelines. And now is being demonstrated in an unwillingness to get vaccinated. And so we really can see in the pandemic both some of humanity's strengths, what happens when we actually do work together, and also the sort of flaws in the various systems of governance around the world and in our collective system of assuring the well-being of all humanity. So when we look at the examples of the best responses, so what I hope to do in the rest of the presentation is to begin to look at some of the positive examples we saw of communities that were demonstrating resilience, that were demonstrating empowerment, and see what were they doing and what were the conditions that allowed them to do this. Before going into examples, a few things I want to talk about. I'm coming from the Baha'i International Development Organization. I don't represent the organization, but my perspectives are shaped by it. And the development organization was established in November of 2018. So in that sense is a new organization, but it's actually an evolution of the Office of Social and Economic Development, OSED, which was established in 1983. So in some sense, we're working with 30 years of experience as Baha'i communities around the world have more systematically begun to apply themselves to social and economic development. The development organization's primary purpose, and the purpose of OSED before it, is to facilitate learning about development within a framework shaped by the Baha'i teaching. So the question is really, how do we take these principles, this framework, and apply it to the betterment of the world, to the, addressing social and economic well-being. And it's, there's no time to go into sort of the dimensions of that framework and, what we've learned so far, but there are a few things I want to point out, some fundamental pieces of that framework. And the first is the recognition of the oneness of humankind. And when we hear that often, I think it's kind of deceptively simple. But actually, the principle of the oneness of humankind really has profound implications for how we organize society, for how we distribute resources, for the nature of governance. So learning for a community to learn how it acts on the basis of recognition of oneness, so that really all of the decisions it makes are for the betterment of everyone and not for one group or another group. Another important principle is the twofold moral purpose, this idea that human beings have a twofold moral purpose. And by that, I mean that on the one hand, our purpose in this life is to develop our spiritual qualities, the talents and capacities with which we're endowed, and everybody has that, right? But that we do that by contributing to the advancement of civilization through service to others. And these two are closely interrelated. You can't do one without the other. So Baha'i efforts towards social and economic development always try and see how we can take spiritual insight and sort of recognize the spiritual dimension of the practical problem of improving the world. Whether it's improving access to water, it's improving the status of women, it's guaranteeing the education of all the children within a community. And it affects, many aspects of how we think about the role that individuals and communities play. And sort of a consequence of these two is that for Baha'is, social change is not something that one group of people does for another. Every person has the ability to contribute to the advancement of their community, and they have the responsibility to do that. And sort of as a corollary, every population has the prerogative to chart its own path of development. And it's very clear that, we have some countries doing very well in certain areas, poorly in others. No country in the world is an ideal that we can accept as developed. So this is a process of discovery. And as different communities in different parts of the world advance along this path and figure out how they apply different qualities, how they address different problems, they will contribute to global learning about development. So as we think then about questions of resilience and empowerment, there's sort of two questions that are at the back of my mind all the time. And one is, how does a population take charge of its spiritual and material progress? This in a way is the definition of empowerment. But also, how do the three major protagonists in development, individuals, institutions, and community, how do they increasingly gain capacity to work together to create justice, to create harmony in society, to guarantee prosperity for all? So these questions shape sort of how I think about the examples that I'm going to share. And as I said before, I'm trying to look at a selection of maybe some of the best examples by my standards and see what can it tell us about that process of empowerment. Now, as I share these examples, just to bear in mind, the experience of COVID hit everywhere, and the experience that Baha'i communities had, as with other communities, varies widely. Some communities were not so impacted by COVID. Others, their health, the economic life was devastated. So you have this range of impact. You also have a range of types of social welfare networks. The degree that the national or regional government has responded and put in motion programs, that varies widely. Some communities already have experience with disasters, have natural disasters on a regular basis. So they may have systems in place to cope with them to a certain extent. And some communities have what we call Baha'i-inspired organizations, which are nonprofits that have been established with the goal of sort of seeing how a particular problem can be addressed in light of Baha'i teaching. So when I worked for the Bahá'í Foundation, it was Baha'i-inspired, and we were trying to address certain questions related to development in China and Macau, in light of our understanding of the Baha'i principles and seeing, how we could learn better how to apply them. So where you have organizations like that sort of impacts the kinds of human resources available. It impacts, sort of some degree of networks that exist. Another, just to point out, I'm not approaching this from the perspective of a humanitarian aid organization, which is trying to get resources to a community as quickly as possible to, solve a particular crisis, nor from government, which has the very complex task of assuring an entire population is being assisted. And I think that also brings its own challenges. Most of the communities, really all the Baha'i communities around the world, are in some sense bridging gaps. So the government has a level of response from 0 to 100, but usually there are places that aren't being reached, or there are hardships that haven't been anticipated and aren't being addressed. And so they're trying to help with that within the limits of their own capacity. About the examples chosen, there were so many things to choose from, different reports that came in to our organization that we were able to see. It became very hard to decide what to choose. And as a result, I've chosen the ones that seem to me to be most relevant. And of course, it's good to keep in mind that these were not reports written by an academic organization. These are, they don't have a statistician looking at the choice of strategy and its economic efficiency. They don't have people hired to write analytic reports. These are communities doing their best under difficult conditions to help those around them. And so their reports are a bit patchwork. And I've done my best to sort of look through them. And in some cases, we've been in conversation with some of the institutions or individuals that are in the country. And in others, there have been some meetings that we've been able to join with them. As I looked at all of the different examples, it became clear that empowered and resilient communities seem to share 4 elements, or at least there are 4 important aspects that enable a community to respond. The first was the strength of the network within the community. And that probably comes as no surprise, but we'll see that the strength of that network determined the speed and the breadth of response. And it also enabled the creativity and the use of local resources. A second element was whether there were processes to identify and raise the capacity of key individuals, right? And how long that had been going on. Whether there was a process of learning and spaces by which, and sort of systems by which learning could flow from the grassroots up to the national level and back down again, with shared experience and down back to the grassroots. Finally, a critical factor was the degree of ability to collaborate with other institutions in the community, including government, tribal, or sort of traditional leadership structures, healthcare agencies, and other NGOs. So these are 4 of, factors that I thought stood out as I looked at the different examples. Okay, now with all of these factors, there are existing sort of research and discourse within academia and within the development field on, and 3 of them that are particularly relevant are around social capital and trust, and particularly as they relate to community networks, also around participation and community development. Right? Finally, around knowledge generation. And today there's really no time to go into those aspects in great depth, but maybe at the end, if we have time, we can talk more about it. And not to say, again, in choosing these examples, not to say that these are necessarily, particularly, different from other things that were done in society. Many groups have responded in similar ways, I feel, but these were examples that I was familiar with and got to know a little bit more about the dynamic. Okay, so some examples, I'm going to look at 3 examples from the Baha'i community. And the first of these was from Guayaquil in Ecuador. Now, at the very beginning of the pandemic, maybe in February of last year or March of last year, you may have seen reference to Guayaquil in the news. And if you did, you most likely saw it because bodies were piling up and the government had no way to collect bodies. So many, and this is a country, Guayaquil is the largest city in Ecuador. It's densely populated. Many of the communities live in crowded conditions. Many are in the informal sector or are day laborers. And COVID snuck into the country before the government had any realization. So they thought they were protected from it. It wasn't there. It turned out that very early on in January, people had been traveling from Spain and had brought COVID. And suddenly you went from conversations, in January where everyone said, no, it's not, we're fine. There's nothing happening. And 2 to 3 weeks later, the country was overwhelmed. Hospitals were overwhelmed. So in Guayaquil, one of the things that you saw was an effort by the Baha'i community in particularly in one of the neighborhoods, but this spread, to distribute food to those who, because of the lockdown, because of the conditions and isolation when people got COVID, had no access to food. And the way this happened was quite interesting because it demonstrates how individual initiative can be built on where you have a network, a strong network in the community. So initially, one of the Baha'is who lives in Guayaquil, his company, he has a small business that packs up food and delivers it to stores, right? So he realized he had access to wholesale groceries and food. People were going hungry, right? And he could use, he had trucks, he could use this to distribute. So he and his friends initially thought, okay, we can get some money, we can buy food, we can help to distribute. At the same time, the local assembly in this community was also looking for trying how it would respond. And so the consultation process carried over by phone and on internet and, you know, in lockdown conditions, they recognized that one of the strengths of this particular community was that there was a junior youth program, a program of education for younger youth, maybe ages 10, 11 up to 15. And that is often carried out by youth who are maybe 15 to early 20s. But because of this education program, those who were animators, youth like these you see in this picture, who were working with these younger youth, they knew many of the families in the community. They knew who had children, who was, you know, and they could easily go through that network of connections they had, and they were able to find out who's in need, who are the vulnerable, whose family has COVID, who can't leave and doesn't have access to food. And so the community itself raised funds. This man who started, you know, with the idea of food distribution donated a truck, and they began to distribute food within the community. Now that was just the beginning. They also distributed medical supplies. But this experience then went, you know, the National Spiritual Assembly was seeing various communities around Ecuador trying to do their best to respond and help others in their community. And so they established a National Emergency Health Committee. And the job of that health committee was to consult with, to get in touch with all the local assemblies, see what they were doing, see what kind of support they needed. And so, and then as things were being learned in different places, this worked, that didn't work, this is a challenge, you know, we need information about medical supplies, what can people use as traditional remedies? Then the committee could step in and find information. So what are the government programs available? If you can't get to a hospital, what can you do for your sick family member? They organized healthcare workers to give online sort of seminars and you know, answer questions for people who couldn't access healthcare. They took, so some communities began to do community gardens to share food. Others did animal husbandry. As Ecuador came out of the worst of the pandemic, how could businesses be helped to restart? And all of these things, there were efforts at local levels that this national committee was learning about, sharing with and they were in consultation with the development organization that could share experience from other countries. And so you created this network where knowledge could be shared. But we could see that sort of the key factors in the response was the extent of the network in the community. Because in those places like Guayaquil, where the network was strong, a lot could be done. In some other communities in Ecuador where the network, for whatever reason, was smaller size or not very strong, there was a limit to what you could do because you didn't know people's real needs. I think the other strength here was that they could mobilize human resources and the system of learning using the National Committee. That they created spaces for learning at the local level, often created by local spiritual assemblies. The committee helped to bring different people together to sort of say, well, we tried this, this is what we're doing, so that learning could flow and that the responses of communities over time could improve. So that's one example. The second example I want to talk about is Central African Republic. And the first couple of pages of slides, I think I have 2 pages, are from a trip that I took in 2019. And if you're familiar at all with the Central African Republic, it's a very poor country. and it's politically quite unstable. And at the moment there is war going on, there's an insurgency. So I'm going to mention this, this organization called Adie Foundation, which is devoted to education. And this is a community school in Bangui, the capital city. I'll talk about that in a minute. But overall in the country, educational structures are weak, and periodically things get disrupted by war. And when I talked to Adie Foundation in some of our emails back and forth, understanding what was happening, and then now seeing what's happening under this new political conflict, right? The person who wrote back said, well, you know, of course, the rebels are now coming in. They're at the outskirts of the city, and they're actually, their base is very close to our organization. But don't worry, the bullet holes didn't do any damage. You know, so this is the kind of place and the conditions that they're often working under. So this idea of community schools is one that has been a response of Baha'is particularly in Africa and the Pacific, but in a number of different countries. And the idea is that, you know, it's something that happens in places where the existing educational system isn't really able to meet the needs of the population. Maybe there just aren't schools, the government isn't effective in places like the Central African Republic. It might be that there are government schools, but teachers don't show up. Or there are so many people in a class that kids aren't learning, right? 150 people, you know, and so in places like the Central African Republic, Baha'is who are committed to education began to get involved, and Adie Foundation, which is the one in Central African Republic, was one of the first. In fact, I think it was the first one that developed a program to train people from villages who wanted to start schools. And it trains their teachers. It doesn't provide any financial support for the school, but it provides training for the teachers. And the training goes beyond just, you know, how do I teach math in primary one? How do I teach, you know, social studies, whatever the national curriculum is. But it begins to look at building the intellectual and moral capacity, the spirit of service of the teachers, their recognition of their role as a promoter of community well-being. And so, and the other thing is, how does, you know, they're concerned with how does a ownership of the educational process get fostered in these communities. So all of these schools are actually built entirely by the local, you know, certainly the initial school. Sometimes when it's expanded, they apply for other funding from other sources. This school on the left, they actually have a very nice building. This is the group of students coming to sing and welcome us. I have another video of another school where amazing welcome that we received. This school actually has a very nice building, but the government is expanding the road, so that's getting destroyed. What you see in the back behind them, the thatch building, is their temporary school while they build a new school. But you can see this new school coming up in the brick building behind. And what you probably can't see that well is that is a beautiful building. Attention has been given not only to its structural integrity, and of course it's not done, but to its beauty. And you can sort of see the decorations done in brickwork that allow flow of air within the buildings. And that's done that well because this community, they happen to be bricklayers, many of the parents. And they use that and you know, they're making the best building they can. And so these community schools are able to become a center of learning within the community. The teachers are able to share knowledge that they're learning about agriculture or health and to attend to the education of the kids. But in Central African Republic, as elsewhere, in the pandemic, schools got shut down. But there was a variety, you know, regulations changed periodically. So it went from, you can only have 5 people together. No, you can have 10, wait, no, you can't. You know, so there was a lot of change in regulation as the country tried to figure out a way to control the spread of the virus and maintain education. But you can imagine in a situation like this, look at the previous slide and these slides, these are kids that don't have access to internet. Anything done in education now has to be done somehow within the regulations. And what was really interesting about this response was that essentially the community schools, by consulting among themselves and with the ADIE Foundation, came up with the idea of training parents and finding youth, better educated youth who are maybe now because of pandemic coming back from high school, which usually has to be outside the village, or from even college, and training them to offer educational content. So what was a school of 400 kids with a number of teachers, the teacher now taught the kids that were immediately around her building, her house, you know, and wouldn't break regulations to meet with them outside. And that's the kind of thing you're seeing in the right picture. And youth who came back begin to also work with kids. And so they really had this unified response. And you also saw that the moment that the pandemic was sort of shutdown was announced, parents came to the school, only one there is the principal now, and said, what can we do? You know, how can we make sure the teachers are going to be okay? How can we make sure that our kids continue education? So you had this community response. I think there are a number of things that are also interesting is they were able, again, because of an existing relationship of trust, and these teachers are part of the community, they have been contributing to it, sharing knowledge, serving the kids with, you know, and the families with self-sacrifice. And as a result, they're trusted. And people turn to them for accurate information about the virus. And they responded, you know, so, and also I think here, you had very close relationships that had developed early from the establishment of the school. The school belongs to the community. So oftentimes the land was given by the local chief, the, you know, maybe in one case, this might have been from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but I think it was actually Central African Republic. They wanted to see, as the school got bigger, how could they fund more teachers? Parents could only pay so much. So the chief said, you know, we have a well in the center of the community. When everyone uses that well, they'll pay a fee. And when they pay that fee, we'll give it to that school. And this way we'll support the development of the school. So because you had already a strong collaboration with local leaders, then there could be a free flow of consultation about how to adapt education, stay within the government guidelines, and assure that children were well educated. And you also had a real sense of ownership. These parents, you know, and the whole community, even if you weren't a parent, recognized the importance of assuring that all the children got a good education and not allowing the pandemic to stop everything. They also, you know, where there were some agriculture, they began to do that. So, you know, there was a variety of response, but at the heart of it was this strong community network. It was spaces in which the community consulted and had learned the skills of consulting to solve problems and acting together to implement plans. And then you had a network that extended beyond the local community, where learning could be shared, best practices could be discovered, and additional resources could be sought if needed. Let me see what time it is. Okay, a little longer. One last example, which comes from India, and I'll go very quickly, but in India, such a big country, so complex, you had so many good examples of ways in which the community was responding. Food distribution, which you see in the right, upper right, teachers preparing notebooks. We have pictures of teachers holding class on mobile phones with groups of students around them, one mobile phone and the teacher on the other end to assure that education could continue. In other cases, teachers preparing all the notebooks and bringing it and leaving it at a distance from the schools of their class, you know, of the homes of their students. Teachers, a network of schools, again, community schools that began to consult with one another about how they could continue to make sure that teachers had adequate resources, because without income, the schools don't pay. I don't know how schools pay. You pay for education in Israel. In Macau, where I'm familiar with, you pay at the beginning of the semester for at least 6 months. Usually you pay the full year's tuition ahead of time. In places like this, you pay month by month or week by week. So when school shut down, the school's income shut down and they couldn't pay teachers. So how could they make sure that teachers would have food, would be well? And you know, that you have the youth taking to educate others. This was a early pandemic. They're not wearing masks. I don't think COVID had hit the rural areas at that time. And another example here of a group of adults, young adults, who came up with a method of allowing people to wash their hands in places that didn't have running water. So we had a lot of examples in India. And one of the most interesting was at the level of in a place called Nasik, where there's a particular community that has 5 villages. And in that village, prior to the pandemic, again, in these 5 villages, the families had already become connected very well through shared devotional meetings, through classes for moral education of children and youth. And so many of the families in these 5 villages were already participating in these activities, and the network among them was already strong. But sometime before the pandemic, the local assembly in that community said, we've got all these families, how do we work with them? They had grouped them into, you know, sort of family groups that might, I think they had 48 family groups across 5 villages. So each family group might be between 5 families and 10 families, depending on the size and just, you know, where people lived, how closely they could gather. And these family groups would come together and say prayers, and they'd consult about what was going on in their community. And before the pandemic, they had already started to take action about different issues in their community, early marriage of girls, you know, things like making sure that all the children could pass exams and continue their education. And in that space, parents, you know, initially many parents were like, education, not so important, let them go to work. Didn't do well on exams, let them go to work. So, but through consultation in those spaces, those attitudes started to change. And you began to see real attention to how we could assure the education of the community. And so they had started, prior to the pandemic, tutorial schools. And in one of these communities, because of these tutorial schools, that year, which was just last year, all of the students passed their exams, and all of them were able to continue in high school. And that led to the next discussion, which was about early marriage, because in that place, again, girls dropped out because at 15 or 14, their parents married them off to someone and off they went. And discussions in these kinds of community spaces led to, you know, in fact, they said that in these villages, only one family still married off their daughter very early. The rest of them decided to have their children finish education, at least through high school. So they already had a very strong network, and they were used to discussing. They had developed the habit of discussing social issues, coming up with plans, reflecting on what had worked and what hadn't done. And it happened through this network of families. But at the same time, the local assembly was identifying who within these family groupings had particular capacity, who could mobilize people, who could get people to come together, and had been meeting with them regularly and studying materials with them to help build their capacity. So when the pandemic hit, it was relatively easy for these communities to start thinking, well, who within our network of families doesn't have enough food? Whose children can no longer visit, the widow whose children can't visit, so now is in hardship? And then to respond to that, again, by providing food and necessities. But the government had a program to provide food, basics, rice, oil, things like that. But they realized within the community, some people couldn't get it because they didn't have the right ID. Maybe they didn't have a birth certificate, so they couldn't get an ID. So then the community, you know, was able to find out exactly who in the community was in hardship, who didn't have an ID. The initial response was to provide whatever they could. but they also went to the government and helped come up with a way that the government could register and get these families' IDs. As the pandemic went on, they began promoting certain agricultural processes, established community farms, small farms that they used to grow food that was then distributed. They had various creative means to support education, as I said. And they had these networks of schools trying to see how to assure the well-being of teachers and the continuing education of the children. And actually what was interesting, I mentioned this tutorial school that they had. And at the beginning of the pandemic, they had been trying, and it hadn't gotten that far. They had maybe 40 students. During the pandemic, they used this tutorial space to set up a place where youth or teachers could work with small groups of children and offer tutorial and help them continue their education while the schools were closed. And now they said they had so many people, the schools have reopened, kids are back in school, but the community values this tutorial system and the education the children were getting so much that it's continued, and they now have over 240 students in this program. Again, following regulations, but you see in this how the strength of this network, in this case, linking groups of families, enabled the community to identify where the real needs were and what resources the community could draw on. I think the other strength that they had was this ongoing process of developing human resources that had been going on prior to the pandemic. So you had people that were used to gathering people, facilitating a discussion, talking about matters that were relevant to the community in a way that built unity. And in these discussions, these sort of spiritual or moral values of creating unity, of justice, of cultivating a spirit of generosity, those were always part of an explicit part of the discussion. A recognition that we're all part of one human family, regardless of caste, regardless of economic background, is always shaped that discussion. Also, they had these connections to government. I think I've gone well over my 45 minutes maybe. So as quickly as I can. I think when we look at this, you really do see how where networks have already been strengthened, you have social capital, you have trust, or you're building that actively. And where these values about unity and justice and service and the oneness of humanity are explicit in that discussion, then the community can really respond in a way that's creative and empowering and resilient. But essential to that is building human resources and the kind of human resources who put service at the center of their lives, who are thinking about themselves, not just what can I get, I have some skills, how am I going to sell them, but really, how do I contribute to my community? What are the needs of my community? And where those programs and patterns had also explicitly built scientific capacity, they were doubly strong. Again, having a systematic process of learning and spaces in which communities can consult and learn the skills of consultation and of collective action, which are not always easy things to learn. And do that in light of values and that are important to the community. Then it tended to be successful. Where you didn't have this, or where at the higher levels, rather than thinking about how to support activity, they began to direct activity, things tended to fall apart, or at least become not so well tailored to the reality. And finally, this collaboration with government, and we saw that this was built over time. Initially, often communities are reluctant. They feel, depending on where you are, in some places from the beginning, like in a village in Africa, in Central African Republic, already everything's together. There's no sort of government. There's local government, tribal chiefs. People are very much connected to that. In a place like Delhi or Nasik or Mumbai, or some of the villages outside those bigger cities, the government is very alien. You know, it's not something you interact with as a small group of people. And so confidence, first, for the government to pay attention to you, for you to have something to say, that took time to build. But in places where you had some foundation in the pandemic, they were really able to draw on that, and their response was more effective because you brought together the community and the institutions and individuals in addressing a problem. The challenge, the big challenge with this that I see in terms of its application more widely is one of time and scale. You know, it takes time to build these capacities. And so often our responses are time bound. In a pandemic, fine, you know, there's a need for that. And you know, in a disaster, you have to respond quickly. And there isn't time to say, oh, maybe we'll do it this way, you know. But in many other things, we design projects in discrete times with carefully chosen or not so carefully chosen objectives and indicators, and they have to be met by a certain amount of time. And that puts pressure that tends to undermine a process of learning within a community, because you have to get to the results fast enough to, you know, show that you were worthy of the grant and get the next grant. Okay. And I do see that also in the governments and sort of at various levels, finding ways to work with local groups that may initially be very inefficient, you know, that may take time to figure things out, also is a challenge. You know, governments have objectives. They may have voters that are saying, why aren't you solving this problem? They're working with big complex systems. So I see these are sort of what we're seeing at the level of villages and neighborhoods and smaller communities that have had time to build things, how we scale that up, the kinds of systems that have to be put in place. That's a challenge for, I think, for us, and I think generally in development. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll stop here. I hope that wasn't too much over time, and just see if anybody has questions or comments, or however this relates to some of the experience maybe that you've had or things that you've seen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noguchi. We have, in the meantime, 2 questions. First, Dr. Glenn Segal asking, do you see COVID-19 bringing global social change as a result of the oneness of humanity in daily life? That the oneness of humanity is where people help each other as one of the necessities of proactive and nonviolent constructive resilience, the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. What will be the most important global social change?
Okay, that's a hard question. I do think that the pandemic has brought to light the shortcomings, you know, and demonstrated the potential there is where you have recognition of the oneness of humanity. I think that the implementation of that is a complex process. I don't imagine that in 2 years, we'll see now that communities are able to demonstrate constructive resilience. But I do think that so you have to look at it at different levels. And I think this process of transformation occurs at different levels and sort of in an interactive way over time. So in places where let's say starting at a local level, you know, places like the examples I've shared, the capacity of these communities to respond has been strengthened, and their recognition of their capacity has been strengthened. Then at the global level, I think there's growing discourse, growing recognition that our systems, our global systems are too complex for individual countries to solve things. You know, when I was teaching in Hong Kong, I was in the Department of Social Work and Social Administration, and one of the phrases that was often used was wicked problems. And to be honest, when I first heard it, I thought, maybe this is a weird Chinese translation of something. But it's actually a common use term in social work to refer to problems that are too complex for any one entity to address alone. Government can't do it, business can't do it, communities pulling themselves up by the bootstraps can't do it, and it needs a thoughtful response to be developed over time that engages all the participants, all the protagonists of society. And I think really this process of global change, global social change, is that type of problem. It is not a 5-year or a 10-year enterprise. But what I do think the pandemic has brought is a recognition, and hopefully one that will be built on, that the nature of the problems requires global cooperation. So at that level, and then at the community level, I think you've strengthened that process by which communities are learning to operate at a level of oneness. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
Others may have comments.
Glenn, would you like to comment, or you're okay with it? I mean, Glenn? No response.
Oh yeah, no, I'm okay with that. I understand the difficulties, but I appreciate the fact that small changes will eventually lead to big changes. And this is the whole understanding of what a oneness is that in 200 years of Bahá'í understanding of constructive resilience in light of oppression, this is one step forward where a global pandemic may actually assist that by virtue of the fact of more people helping each other rather than being engaged in violent activities. So thank you very much for your answer. Thank you.
Thanks. The next question is from Holly Hansen. You mentioned the strengths of networks. Is it correct that across your 3 examples, is that community members were able to identify who were the people with real needs?
Yes, I think that was one of the, one aspect is that they were able to identify who was really in need, but they were also able to identify resources within their community and to respond in ways that I think if you were looking from a regional level, if you were a government official outside the immediate community, you wouldn't have seen. So for example, where youth who originally were at college or there was another example from Uganda where youth, again, because of the lockdown, youth who were in the university all had to go back to their villages. And one of the villages or towns, Jinja, they began to do sort of think about, well, now we have all these youth here, what can be done? How can they, use what they're learning, begin to think about the community and really take some action? And then working with government, and they began to study some different materials. The youth began to study the PSA program. Some of you might be familiar, preparation for social action. And they started a research project on their village that was very useful for the government to identify certain needs in the communities, certain resources in the community. And again, these were youth who'd returned home, but from a government perspective were invisible, but the community recognized them as resources. And I think that also is incredibly powerful. Communities have resources at their disposal beyond, we look at particularly poor communities often in the literature, in the government, in government, and we look at them as disadvantaged, as communities in need. But these are communities with immense talent and with capacity, with people who've survived through all kinds of difficulties. Often there are informal ways that a community has come up with to address needs within the community, to assure a certain level of social security, to deal with market fluctuations. And those tend to be invisible. And so oftentimes then efforts to improve community life undermine those structures rather than building on them. And so I think that what we're seeing, both in the strength of these networks, is ability to recognize, and the community itself to recognize who's in need, what are the needs in the community, what are our strengths, and how can we build on those strengths.
Thank you. Mrs. Hanson, comment?
I think what Lori has said about the invisibility of talents is even, and capacities, is maybe even more significant than what I was thinking about, which is so much of the COVID response was very flat to, there are people there who are in this like very big generalization about them, and we are or we are not responding to this sort of category. And one of the consequences is of the like thick social web of connections that you're talking about is people really, really know each other. And so knew this is the family. And of course, even more, they knew, and this is what we can do for them.
And I think, you know, when that consultation and the standards are very open, and there's like spaces where the community sort of says, well, what should the standards be to get economic help? Who should get a loan? Who should get food? We only have, we can help this many people. Who should it be and what are our criteria? Then also a lot of the misuse of funds sort of tends to disappear. And, you know, it really brings out like, you know, it's much easier. A lot of communities are afraid, oh, if we start offering some kind of economic assistance, people are going to take advantage. Or what happens if there's disunity because of this? Which, you know, when it's not done, you know, and a lot of times the first attempts that does happen, right? And then they learn, okay, this is how we have to do it. You know, the committee who's determining the money, they can't get any of it. Their family can't get any of it. The criteria are set by the community. You know, there's a list, everyone can see, you know. So I think there are mechanisms that can come into place when that's explicit and when the network is strong, that those bonds are strong.
Anyone else? Well, I wanted to thank you for bringing those examples, the 3 examples that show us how appreciative we should be in the, shall we say, developed world about the things that we have. We take them for granted, while, as you mentioned, one figure that it quite amazed me is that 2/3 of the children in the world don't have access to Zoom. I think that's what you said.
Internet, no internet.
To the internet, even worse. So, I mean, it gives us perspective about what we do have. But one question I wanted to ask is whether, I mean, how do you try to, I don't want to say market, but how do you try to bring the ideas that you have to the international community and not to specific governments like the governments of the cases that you mentioned? I mean, to some kind of a forums, and whether if you bring those to such forums, international forums, how attentive governments are to these proposals, these ideas, especially from those from the developed world. I mean, probably the underdeveloped, they are probably more attentive to your ideas, but whether there is anything that, I mean, you think that in the developed world would be more, shall we say, improve the system that we have. I mean, here in Israel, I mean, every country is different, but here in Israel, we have a very complex society, Arabs and Jews and religious and the non-religious. You know, they are during your 1 year here, probably you were exposed to that. So on the other hand, we see developed countries that actually succeeded in containing that without vaccination, actually, like in New Zealand, for example. So, I mean, how do you see whether there is any, as we say, ears to hear what you have to say, or they just
You know, I cut an example, and I wanted to actually have examples from developed countries as well, more developed countries. And I cut one from Canada due to time and the fact that my information about it was more limited. There was another wonderful example from Australia. Again, I just didn't have enough information and time to include it. So you do also see in a variety, every country, this kind of response where those principles apply and how the community responds. And I think those ideas are being shared in a variety of ways. And to be realistic, I mean, these are very modest efforts. These are not, I think there are many communities responding this way and learning. And where we see this happening, the agencies involved, if they're organizations or sometimes the Baha'i community itself, is within the country then involved in a learning process. Like ADIE Foundation participates in education forums. It works with the government and the Ministry of Education. So that's in country. And similarly, other communities, if you're interested in an issue, well, you go to the spaces where policy is being set, where things are being discussed, where things are being learned. And communities, you tend to start with more local efforts as they, especially where you have a program or an organization, it gradually also enters into more of these spaces for policy and spaces, that are more international and sort of policy influencing. In the Baha'i International Community, the Baha'i International Community also participates in spaces that are looking at, and of course, they can only handle so many issues. But what we've heard, and recently there was a meeting, and I think some of the other friends here could say a lot more about this, but there is space. I think there are, there are many opportunities because people who are trying to address these issues are looking for ways and insights. And we're not offering also, our experiences are really quite modest, but I think there is interest. And I think the thing is that every community has to trace its path. Once you begin to identify the principles, how do you now have a group of people that begin to think about how this applies in whatever field they are? So if you're working in healthcare and you're at the policy level, how does that apply? If you're in a community and trying to sort of apply it in my neighborhood, what do I do? And then that learning, I think, does spread, is spreading globally. And there are policy forums that are quite interested.
I think what I was actually aiming at is whether the Baha'i community, the international Baha'i community, reached that phase that if there is a problem in anything, they would also invite you to, you or the representative of the BIC to sound or to present their view. Is there such a, you have reached such a level that governments actually coming to Baha'is, they have this, it's a modern religion and it's but they have a very novel ideas about different things, social things, other things, educational and things. Is it happening?
Yeah, it is at different levels. David, I see you shaking your head. Maybe you can say something as part of the, would be a good person to talk on this.
It is happening. The Baha'i International Community has offices around the world and has deep relationships with Baha'i communities, all of whom have, or most of whom have offices of external affairs. And governments are coming to see the Baha'i International Community as a trusted partner in general. Baha'is don't seek recognition or even publicity of any kind when assisting governments and other entities, and so and are very willing to give the credit, if there's such a thing, to others. So this is happening in just about every continent. to one degree or another, that governments are seeking the assistance of, or the insights of the Baha'i international community.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any here. So with that, I would sum up and say, yes. May, you wanted to say
Yeah, I
something?
was just going to add a question if we have time.
Sure, sure, please.
Yeah, I wanted to, I guess, build on some of the other questions that were asked about, you know, what's being learned by the Baha'i community that is, I think, bringing a new perspective on how communities can better prepare themselves to respond to eventualities such as the pandemic. From what you were sharing, it sounds like one of the themes that was highlighted is that many of the capacities that have been relegated to the national level governments or even local level governments are by necessity being devolved to smaller and smaller units, community units, in order to be effective. So for example, deliberative capacities to plan and make decisions about the allocation of resources, the capacity to innovate solutions to complex problems, the capacity to, you know, at a basic level, provide services. Whereas these may have been in the past, you know, carried out by complex bureaucratic top-down systems, I think they reach certain limits quickly with the diversity of communities and also in times of added stress to the system, such as, you know, the pandemic. So yeah, any thoughts you have on that in terms of, you know, how that experience is being distilled or shared?
I think what's maybe different in the Baha'i experience. So this idea of building capacity in local communities is one that is also very much part of development discourse. So from at least the 1980s, you know, sort of the development field has begun increasingly. At first, it was sort of a splinter discourse, and gradually this idea of community empowerment, community development, the capacities of communities, devolving responsibilities, even in finance, has become part of development practice. And there's a lot of learning about it. What I think is different about the Baha'i experience is that it's quite explicit in that the capacities that are being built can't be separated from the kinds of sort of spiritual values and human values that shape response. So a lot of times, for example, the idea of consulting about a problem, identifying a problem, you know, coming up with a series of potential solutions, and then voting on which is the best thing for the community to support. That's done, right? That's understood. But that process tends to be looked at in a way that is mostly mechanical. And, you know, okay, so and so then it becomes, how do we get people to vote? How do we get people to participate in this voting process when we've now identified 4 options for them to choose among? Or the challenge of how do we get people's opinions, you know? And that's very different from a community thinking about what does it mean for us to ensure that the education of every child is equally valued? And what does justice mean in this situation? You know, what does it mean? You know, so that it's not divorced. It's not that, you know, when you go to church, you think about these virtues. And when you say your prayers, if you're someone who prays, you think about this. But then in your everyday, you know, activities, you make decisions based on efficiency and, you know, personal benefit, you know, And so what tends to happen is they do have ways and mechanisms to get communities to participate, or at least a portion, but it tends to result in a lot of political conflict or sort of power, sort of elite capture, because you're not basing it on a process of service and on these values that the community wants to strengthen. And I think that process in the Baha'i community that we're learning about, and some of the educational systems that we're developing and learning to do well, help to develop that capacity in a way that's different from some of what else, add something to what is being learned about this in the wider discourse about participation, about.
Yes, Professor Barasher.
Yes, I have a question. Yeah, I'm very much impressed by this wonderful lecture that you shared with us. And I hear a lot about a lot of success in the activity of in contributing to various countries with your educational and other social activities. But I wonder whether, to what extent you face also in your work frustrations or objections or unwillingness to cope with you on, for example, religious ground, whether some reluctancy or hesitation whether to share with you because of religious considerations. I wonder about this.
When I was working in Macau at the Bahá'í Foundation, the Bahá'í Foundation had this school in Macau, and a lot of our programs were in mainland China, but the school was in Macau. And when we first started, we were trying to understand, we're trying to approach education in a way that develops the moral character of children. And so at some point, the government was giving land to build schools. So every school in Macau could get land and improve their building. And school after school got land. We weren't on the list. And the next round came and we weren't on the list. And the next round came and we weren't on the list. And at that time, this was under Portuguese rule. This is before Chinese rule. And the principal of the school then went to meet with the head of the education department and said, well, we're, we're hoping to be able to get land. And he said, you want to be a part of Macau. You want to, be considered part of this community. Now you are a foreign thing. You want to be part, you kill your Baha'i faith. Use those words. But it's interesting. So that happens at various times, right? Often in the beginning, there's some point, but over time, it doesn't matter for us. Okay, fine, they don't want us and we'll have to work without this. That's fine, we'll continue. But what happens over time is gradually the circle of people that say, actually, they're doing very nice things. They're trying, and they're inviting us in, let's participate, grows. So later, really, eventually we were given, just to go back to my story, eventually we were given land, the worst land that could possibly be given, in the most awkward place, funny little sliver of land in triangle shape that was hard to build a school on. And the contract for all the schools was 2 years. You had to build your school. So we tried to raise money. And then every step we took that was sort of a different way, common internationally, but not done in Macau, the education department came in and publicly said, not talking to us, this is illegal. You can't do this. So we couldn't raise the money. And we gave the land back because we knew we couldn't build in 2 years. So we gave the land back. And at the time, everyone said, these people are stupid. What in the world? We should just keep it. Eventually they get the money, they build a school. But we thought, no, we had a contract. We're not going to be able to do it now. Well, what happened was a lot of schools couldn't build their schools. A lot of schools got the land, couldn't build. They couldn't raise the money. And they wouldn't give the land back. And the government had to go to these great lengths and bring people to court and try and get the land back. And so about 5, 6, 7 years later, maybe it was as much as 10 years later, the government now had shifted and it was now Chinese influence, not Portuguese influence, because that was a whole Catholic thing. It was about Catholicism and the view of the Baha'i faith at that time. Well, now they looked back at this foundation that had given the land back, and instead of saying, what fools, they said, this is a group that was trustworthy. So we got an excellent plot of land, we got loans, we got grants, and they really supported us because in that interim, and it took more than 10 years, they saw that we were sincere in trying to contribute to Macau. We were trustworthy. And I think that is what happens mostly. So there is opposition. There's also a learning process. So not every effort works. I chose good examples. There are also examples where things didn't go so well. And you know, that's a learning process. But I think also the fact that we can look at it and say, that really didn't go very well. And what can we do better and continue means that things don't get sidetracked. It's fine. Nobody worries. Well, people worry sometimes, but you shouldn't. Yeah. But yeah, that happens and it's fine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Noguchi, I wanted to thank you on behalf of everyone, I'm sure, for a great presentation and illuminating lecture. And I wish you success in your struggles with those who are not easy to contain with, and see you all in our next lecture in the lecture series. And before we depart, I just wanted to thank Dr. Elham Afnan for her cooperation on organizing this series, and of course to Mr. James Wood, who assisted in all the technical aspects of this, I would say, project. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity and for getting to meet a little bit this group of people and really to share a little bit of experience. Thank you.
Let's hope that this will become not a virtual one, but also a physical one.
That would be nice.
Thank you. All the best.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.